If you've been with Confused Matthew from the beginning, you may remember that I had talked about the last 3 films in the TNG franchise many years ago, but since have taken those reviews down. The reason I did this isn't necessarily because I've changed my mind about any of them. In some ways I have, and in some ways I haven't. But the real reason I took them down is because the format and recording quality didn't match what my reviews had become. In fact, the 3 videos that dealt with First Contact, Insurrection, and Nemesis weren't really reviews at all. At the time, I hadn't even decided that I was going to be a review site. I basically just talked about 1 or 2 issues that I had with the films rather than reviewing them as a whole. That, along with the terrible audio quality, was the reason I took them down, and I figured I would go back and re-record them at a later time. Well, it's been 5 years since I did those videos, and it may also interest you to know that it's been a whopping 10 years, nearly, since I have seen any of the Next Generation movies, with the exception of Generations, which I watched again for the purposes of review. Ugh. I still know the movies inside and out because I used to watch them all the time, but I haven't really seriously thought about them in almost a decade, again, except for Generations. So I'm now setting out to review the last 3 films again, and I recently sat down and watched them all again for the first time in years. And in doing so, I realized that this is exactly what I needed. Time away from these movies in order to regroup and reassess. Because in all honesty, I went into these movies with absolutely the wrong attitude the first time I saw them, and I hadn't really gotten past that the first time I tried to review them. As I said in another video, Star Trek The Next Generation was the first Star Trek series I had ever seen, and I was a mega fan of the show. At the time, the only movies that existed were from the original series, and needless to say, they made some damn good ones. At its best, I saw the original franchise crank out cinematic masterpieces. So when I heard they were doing a Star Trek The Next Generation film, I was stoked. Now it's our turn, I thought. We're gonna make great movies. We're gonna make movies that take all the greatness of the series and propels it into movie greatness. And that's where my attitude kind of set the bar a little too high, I think. It's one thing to expect a good quality movie, but this was different. Every time I went into a Next Generation film, I went in expecting Our Wrath of Khan or Undiscovered Country. Needless to say, that never came close to happening. In fact, the first time I saw Generations, even getting past the terrible, awful, convoluted atrocity of a film that turned out to be, it also caused me to realize one unfortunate thing. Making that great Next Generation movie was going to be a lot harder than I thought. Star Trek made the transition to film exceptionally well because it already had a main focus that was film-friendly: Kirk, Spock, and Bones. This trinity was always at the epicenter of the series. Now, that's not to say that the other characters were meaningless, just framed in a different way. Star Trek was all about diversity and the understanding that you could have virtually every ethnic group imaginable all serving on the same ship, and no one would even think twice about it. Again, that's not to say that the supporting cast didn't have any character at all, but it was what they represented that always mattered just a bit more than deep character backstories for all of them. Whenever an issue was debated or an action was taken on that show, it always came down to how these 3 characters dealt with it. Star Trek The Next Generation went a completely different way. On this show, each and every cast member had a character that was completely fleshed out. Character arcs and deep backstories were given to everyone, and each episode was seen as an opportunity to put 1 or 2 characters in the spotlight at a time. Now, this worked exceptionally well in the series, but trying to take that big a cast and give each and every one of them their own piece of the pie in a movie simply wasn't possible. And when you look to where to put the focus for a film, you find that's a little trickier this time around, because you didn't have that clear-cut main dynamic that the original series had. The Next Generation worked with smaller, more individual dynamics that made for great television, but became difficult when thinking in terms of a film. The easiest characters to make the focus of a feature film are Picard and Data, but even here it was very difficult to have them remain in character and give them something to do that was in any way cinematic. We saw this in all of its dismal reality in Star Trek Generations. Here we have Picard, completely in character, more so than in any film to come, and all he does is brood and cry. The solution to this from that point on seemed to be to take these guys out of character, or at least beef up aspects of them that would be more dramatic, like screaming while shooting a gun or slamming a gun into glass. This didn't really improve things for me either, but the bottom line is, this was going to be a hard road from the start. But I think my mistake in judging these films from the get-go was that I went in expecting a great movie every time. Or to put it even plainer, I set the bar to Star Trek II, and every time that didn't happen, I automatically wrote these off as bad movies rather than judging them on their own terms. The exception to this was how I viewed Star Trek Nemesis, which I saw as the only good attempt at making a film, but the problem in how I originally judged that film was almost the opposite of how I judged the others. So, why did I do this? Well, honestly, I did this out of pure frustration that we just couldn't seem to pull it together. I felt like the original series films, the good ones anyway, would be forever held in the highest esteem of film and cinema, whereas ours would be stuck in the kiddie pool for all that time, to be watched for mere entertainment forever and always. Truth be told, these movies embarrassed me as a TNG fan. I didn't want to believe that this was the best we could do in a film series. We can't make a great TNG film was something that I just wasn't willing to accept, nor could I delude myself into pretending that any of these films were great. But watching these films again without that expectation gave me a completely different experience. Maybe not a different overall opinion of these films, but I found I could now accept them for what they were rather than what they could have been. In short, I was originally being childish. I was wrong to say that no Next Generation film was any better or worse than Generations. That simply isn't true. What I actually meant is that no Next Generation film ever reached a level of quality and greatness as Wrath of Khan or any of the brilliant original films. And while that may be true, that doesn't mean that all the TNG films were exactly the same. Were any of these movies great? No, absolutely not. But that doesn't mean they were all bad. Some of them were, but in order for me to give these fair reviews, I need to get away from this idea that they were bad simply because they weren't our Wrath of Khan, to judge them on their own terms rather than holding them to some idealistic standard that, in all honesty, they were never going to live up to in the first place. This is what I hope to do with these reviews, starting with First Contact and ending with Nemesis. There's no real reason for me to go through Generations again. That one was absolutely a terrible film, even holding it to its own standard or to any other standard at all. Now, the last thing I want to say about these TNG reviews is that, as you've probably noticed, there are a few of these on the market today, and a lot of the TNG fans that later became reviewers saw a lot of the same flaws as I did. This means that repetition is likely to creep into my reviews as well. SF Debris and Red Letter Media have both done excellent reviews of these films, and so a lot of the same points are likely to be made in mine. Especially with regard to Insurrection. Even the people who liked that movie seem to see the same flaws in it. The only major difference between my reviews and others may be that, 1, I don't think First Contact was as good as everybody else did, and 2, I don't think Nemesis was as bad as everybody else did, and hopefully I can explain why in the reviews. So keeping all these things in mind, stay tuned for the TNG movie reviews starting with First Contact. Thanks for watching.